it's crazy, but it
You're
seems
watching
so
Channel Z,
logical.
the world's leading
Try to
zombie
fight
apocalypse
it,
channel.
but it's something
Broadcasting live from Studio Z.
makes me act the way I do.
Hello, welcome to Zombie History, where we explore the buried past. I hope you're ready to unearth some history with us today. I'm your host, Dr. Mzili Kazi Kone, and I'm here with my co-host, Liz Grumbach, who's joining us today. Hello, Liz. How are you?
Hi, Ms. Kazi. I'm good. How are you in the apocalypse
Oh,
today?
one day at a time. That's all
Yeah.
we can really. Sometimes in the apocalypse, it really is 1 foot at a time. So
Oh, it's totally that. Or one meal at a time. I know we're talking about food today.
that's right. I think that's really appropriate, 1 meal at a time. And when you're not eating, thinking about the next meal.
Yes.
Yes, that's right.
So speaking of, so what undead stories are we focusing on today, Ms. Kazi?
Well, we're really rooting this story in a discussion of the land and growing food. And really, when we explore those histories of land and food growth, it takes us back to thinking through the eras of enslavement within the United States and the role and central role of agriculture for many enslaved, or AKA human trafficked people who were in the Americas, broadly throughout the Americas, but of course, in this case, as we focus on the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So really thinking about that, the role of food, agriculture, growing of the crops, our connections to the land, and how does that change after the end of slavery?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so before we get to that, I do know that we had some people interacting with us on social media in advance of this episode today. And I'm just going to bring that up really quick because we're going to be talking about food. So we had this Twitter poll: do you grow food at home or in a community garden? And I'd love to start and dinner from my garden were the two most voted on. But like there was that too busy fighting zombies was in a really close second, honestly. So I think that that's a good point, is that sometimes the legacies of the structures of the world make it a little hard for us to think about growing our own food or food in general. And then we had some really awesome interactions with Johanna here, like there are things that they grow, and to this statement that you can grow in a small space. And I know that we're going to get to kind of growing in urban spaces towards in this episode as we bring on our guest, which is really exciting. So I'm exciting. But now we're going to dive deep and we're going to unearth some buried past.
Sure.
Right? So,
and even as I see those polls, it makes me think of, for a lot of us during this era of COVID, we've been reinvigorated by this sense of going back and gardening or having a little space to grow and what that signifies for us. But when we take it back to the era of enslavement and the time after the ending of slavery in 1865, the promises that were made to the formerly enslaved population about what they would receive, right, after generations of unpaid labor and really generations of unpaid debt due to them, right? So the expectation that they would receive land. Popularly, we discussed it as the receiving of 40 acres and a mule, this expectation that you would get land, right, back to be able to till yourself, to grow crops yourself, and to survive off of. But Liz, when we think about it, there are all these other things that happen after the end of slavery that really limit people's ability to actually do that, right? So like the Black Codes, Liz, right? The Black Codes.
Yeah. I think it's time to talk about the Black Codes, right? And there's time to talk. So there was this moment, I think, after the Civil War, right, where there was kind of promise of reparations. But then I think very quickly after that, maybe with the assassination of Lincoln and all kinds of other things that were happening in the government at the time, and the pressure that Southern plantation owners were putting on the government, there were all of these things that were instituted as policies for really to, I think, continue the legacy of slavery. Would you say that, Ms. Lakazi?
That's right. I mean, you get the official end of slavery, but you get all of these systems in place that really uphold similar systems. So whether it be the Black Codes or moving on to the era of Jim Crow, right? These are laws that actually dictate where people can be, right? The actual space. Laws, when we think of in terms of legalized segregation, right? We're talking about Jim Crow laws that kind of limit the space. But the policing of one's space after the end of slavery, where you could be, right? Whether or not you were tied to a farm or a plantation. We see this as connected to even after the end of slavery, of needing to be connected to a plantation, right? Or the ways in which many folks who had been enslaved on these plantations, many stayed on those plantations as sharecroppers, right? Growing food in their own plots, but having to pay the landlord in their own food. Right?
Well, like, let's talk about sharecropping and how fucked up a system this was, right? And it was an attempt to keep Black people working on plantations for plantation owners.
That's right. After the end of slavery, right?
After the end of slavery, formerly enslaved people that were basically in this in a new kind of enslavement, right?
That's right.
And I love this definition that we have, right? Because it really did, like, the history of sharecropping made this a system of economic dependency and poverty, and we still see the legacy of that today in our relationship with the land.
That's right.
And I do, you're bringing up Black codes a little bit, and I maybe think it's time, like, I would love to chat with you about Black codes, because this was another kind of institution of how to control Black people's relationship with the land, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and other folks, right? I mean, Black codes could be this idea that if you were a Black person walking on the sidewalk, that you would have to move for a white person, right? Or to not move is considered somehow uppity or an offense, right? A criminal offense, right? So these limitations on one's movement of space and place, and these things that could be punishable by imprisonment, right? So the Black codes creates this kind of whole additional legal system that manages people's movement and space, and you could be incarcerated. You could be after the end of slavery incarcerated for some of these things, or for loitering, right? Not being on the land or working someone's land or showing proof that you worked someone's land, right? This sense of loitering that you could be locked up for.
And it was like things like loitering, breaking curfew, vagrancy, owning weapons, not carrying proof of employment. Right. So that, I mean, we can see kind of some of the legacies again of these things that are still happening.
That's right.
But then now I think what the Black codes lended itself to was also the institution of convict leasing. And Ms. Elkazi, I would let's talk about this fucked up thing that is convict leasing, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we just discussed the Black codes, right? And these things that you could be criminalized for doing or not doing, right? And so the criminalization, right, where just like we discussed today, often means incarceration, right? Right, being imprisoned. Okay, so this move to incarcerate a lot of people, right? Many formerly enslaved folks, move them into the incarceration system, prisons, and they could be leased out to plantations to work, right? So this idea of being able to, lend your prison population to work on plantation or on the side of a road, that is called convict leasing, right? And so we see here some images of folks who've been convicted, right? And doing this kind of labor, okay? And that's not even the most shocking. I mean, it is shocking, but beyond that is to see that children themselves could be locked up and also part of the system of convict leasing.
I was just about to bring this up because we do have this image to show, and this is juvenile convicts working on a plantation. And this was from the early 1900s. The Library of Congress said it was 1903. And this is just a haunting image. Because it does, and I think there was a scholar called Blackmon in 2008 that basically said that convict leasing was slavery by another name, and that's really what it is. And this picture, I think, is especially something that highlights that for me.
That's right.
This just slavery by another name. Go ahead.
Well, it ties us. So yes, and Liz, it ties us to what we talk about in today's terms as the prison industrial complex, right? This idea, this whole system around prisons. And even to this day, prisoners serve as cheap, very cheap labor in our society, whether making bras for Victoria's Secret or being leased out to be able to do things that we need, at least in our state of California, put out fires. right? So
Mhm.
folks who will be come out of prison to put out fires, to go back in. And remember, when these folks are actually freed from prisons, many of which are unable to actually work within that same system that they worked in while incarcerated.
Mhm. And there's this really important comment. Thank you so much, Dr. Scott, for commenting that there are resources out there for you to learn about this. This is one of them. This documentary is one of them. But there are amazing projects. Like if anyone has heard of the Convict Leasing and Labor Project, which is a nonprofit organization that's kind of trying to document these things and bring them to light. And think about, I think, as Ms. Elakazi just said, the legacy that they have on the way that we think about imprisoned people
That's
in the
right.
U.S.
And even incarceration or the relation between kids, youth, and policing. Right? When we talk in this current day about the school to prison pipeline, or there's critiques of having cops in schools and metal detectors in schools, right? When we connect it back to convict leasing, or we connect it back to even particularly youth, right? We see it's a much longer history, much longer story of connecting and policing of people, but also in this example, the policing of kids.
Thank you so much. And I think that one of the things that I love that we do at Zombie History, right, is we take these deep histories and we connect them to what's currently ongoing.
That's right.
And now I know that this is a really excellent time to kind of turn to the current moment, the modern farming practices, our modern relationship to the lands, what that looks like. But before we go there, I do want to say that for anyone watching out there, make sure you punch that like button. Maybe like how I want to punch Jim Crow legacy in the face, like just like punch it like you're punching Jim Crow, right? Or punch it like you're punching like the prison industrial complex.
There we
Maybe
go.
How does that sound, Dr.
Hey,
Koenig?
that sounds
Yeah.
like quite the like, and
Yeah,
quite the subscribe
please
right
like.
there.
And while you're down there, also maybe subscribe, ring that bell. But I think now we get to introduce our amazing guest for today,
That's right.
Dr. Koenig.
We are so lucky. We're so lucky to have our guest with us today. It's a crossover episode, and we're here with Dr. Erica O'Neill, the host of Eat, Pray, Run. Welcome, Dr. Erica. Hello. How are you?
Hello. How are you both doing this morning?
Oh, we are excellent. I mean, thinking, of course, about the land. So let me just hop on in here. We're thinking about kind of going back to the land and what that means. But let me ask, in this apocalyptic moment where a lot of folks have come back to trying to plant their own seeds or have their little gardens wherever they can fit it. Let me ask you, do you have an apocalypse garden, or do you want one?
I just moved into a new place, so I don't have my apocalypse garden yet. But I do all of the strange homesteading things that I can to try and be more resilient and reliant on myself instead of having to outsource that to others in times of crisis. So when COVID rolled around, I could eat deep out of my pantry for months without having to leave.
Ready to go.
I am amazed by that. Every time I hear you talk about this, especially on Eat, Pray, Run too, but like just in general, I'm always just amazed. Your pantry is stocked. Like you're ready. You're ready for the apocalypse that we're currently in.
Get yourself a dehydrator.
Yes.
Learn how to can stuff.
I love it.
We
And
really
if you
need
have,
to.
yeah, we do. And if you have that dehydrator, if you have those skills, then having a garden, right, is all the more cool.
Yes.
That's
So I've
right.
been participating in something called the Borderland Produce Rescue since I don't have a garden right now. And for $12, you get 70 pounds of produce that you can then redistribute among people who are around you that would also like to benefit from that. So if you are in Arizona, I highly recommend that. They're fantastic, and you're helping to save produce that would otherwise end up in the landfill.
Wow.
That's awesome, because I think it's something that we wanted to maybe chat with you about, Erica. Is like, what do these programs do? Like, something we talk about in Zombie History is resistance, and what resistance looks like right now, and the small acts that resistance can be. And it sounds like this project is resistance. Are there any other, like, what other things does resistance look like in this space?
There are so many community gardens around Arizona right now, a lot of which are Black and people of color owned, which is fantastic because there's a long history of taking that sort of self-reliance away in this sort of legacy of states like sanctioned poverty and the way that we've structured our communities around food. So if you have any extra bandwidth and can volunteer at any of those, you could find some in your own community. I'm absolutely certain. And it's really rewarding. If you don't have a garden, you can find a garden and you can get your hands in the dirt. And it just feels so good to be able to do that. Like I don't know what it connects to higher in the brain, but it just feels so good to get your hands in dirt like that.
That's right. And the fact that it's community oriented with a lot of these community gardens, what does it mean to go be in community with your neighbors, to go out there and plant and harvest together? I think the flip side of thinking about having access to spaces like community gardens is to think about the flip side, the food desert, right? So how do places like food deserts zombify us?
So that's a huge question. And I feel like if we want to talk about food deserts, we also have to talk about the way that power and structure around the way that we develop these communities has resulted in food deserts. So if you are putting people into red line districts where they cannot have the same access to the different sorts of grocery stores that are around them because they're in highly industrialized areas or adjacent to them, high pollution areas, you have people who are relying on not only what they can get in their environment, which tends to be cheap processed food, but that's also the cheap processed food is being subsidized by the government. So you have these big five, which are corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, and rice. Right here in the US, corn makes up like $116 billion of subsidies since 1995. And then the next closest is wheat at 48 billion and soybeans at 44 billion. So like you're zombified by the fact that these forces are working in the background and you don't even know it. And that's why things are so cheap and affordable and taste good, because they're high calorie, high fat, high salt. Like all of that is subsidized and kind of pushed out. And in communities where you don't have access to fresh and affordable food, that's what you end up relying on. And there's this huge historical legacy of that that we can talk about too.
Yeah, and I think that, I'm thinking about like the dystopia that we could be going into, right? Like this does feel apocalyptic, especially in the way that you're describing it. And it also makes me think, so I'm a movie person, right? So I'm thinking of the movie Demolition Man, where in the future all restaurants are Taco Bell, like, right? And that means that all restaurants are this like, salty, weird, you only want to eat it at 2 a.m. when you're drunk food, right? But you're eating it all the time. So that feels like a dystopia to me.
It is dystopian.
It is. So, we're in the apocalypse now.
That's right.
We've been in the apocalypse for a while. There's like just layers of apocalypses on top of one another.
Yeah. So we've talked about this a little bit, but like how do you see folks being able to de-zombify their relationships to the land? How can we adapt our eating and our growing habits?
If you would like to work that at a very large scale, then you need to advocate for smaller farms, because you have so many processing and sort of farming mechanisms are set up as these strange monopolies. Like if you want your chicken processed, there's like 2 plants that do that in the entirety of the US. And to actually create a third option is a ton of labor. And then you have these sort of pricing structures where you can easily get priced out of that as a small operator trying to like provide beef or chicken processing. And we've kind of created that as we don't just subsidize plants and crops. We also subsidize these sort of like massive agricultural farms where you have these animals that are put in conditions that are not conducive to anything other than raising them and slaughtering them when they are very, very young. And I don't know, like trying to get people to see that what they're eating is more than just something plastic wrapped in a grocery store, whether it's like the protein that you're getting or the plants that you're getting, the crops that you're eating. Like gardening is one way that I feel really connects you to that, because you see the fruits of your labor when you are done.
Yeah.
And no, I don't want to process wheat myself, but I can process other things and still feel that like, okay, I have a better connection and understanding of what I'm eating and where it comes from. And it's the same, like there's a bunch of schools that have these sorts of gardens too, which are trying to do the same thing. Like if you give kids the understanding that what they're eating came from a place and they have the sort of power over that process, I think it really plants good seeds going forward. Puns. So that they can become really productive, like consumers that understand the sort of things that they're putting into their bodies, and the
Right.
maybe get a little hint at sort of the processes and power behind the scenes.
I'm also thinking as you talk, Dr. Erica, about the planting as one side, right? The actual production and seeing the plants grow, and what does that do, as you mentioned, like the connection to your brain, your psyche, your community. I'm also thinking about the flip side of cooking, cooking food, and attempts to reinterpret cultural foods and eating. So I'm particularly thinking about soul food, right? Soul food. Thinking about Black or African American cuisine in the U.S. Right? We call that soul food, and soul food. I mean, the terminology is a more recent term from the 1960s, but the food itself is it's old, right? And I'm thinking now, seeing vegan soul food restaurants, like interpretations of the same food, but veganized, right? To be thinking about, again, where the food comes from and the health benefits. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. So when you're talking about soul food, like it's across a bunch of different cultures, but it really arises from these sort of what's cheap and plentiful for you. So if you are taking offal around you and turning it into something delicious like gizzards, which like fried gizzards are amazing and everyone should try them. That's soul food. You're taking something that nobody else wanted to eat it, and you're flipping it and creating something that's like unique to your cuisine. And it's really based on sort of a deprivation kind of model, but it's kind of empowering too, because it flips that and creates this entire sort of culture around eating. But I love seeing the push towards vegan cuisine, because it's really pushing away from those sort of forces that made you reliant on cheap carbs, cheap lard, cheap sugar, and kind of how that it makes everything taste better. But if you look at sort of like this vegan model, they're trying to create more health benefits while still holding on to that sort of cultural touchstone that's really familiar and important. And there are a ton of great soul food options that are not like high caloric density, and like collard greens are amazing.
That's
And you
right.
can recreate that sort of like smoky flavor without having to use like trotters or anything in there, or bacon, or like really high fat stuff.
I'm
But gives
coming
you that
back in
umami.
to say, like, yes, collard greens are amazing as a vegan. I love this though, because it's also it's making me think of that soul food in itself is resistance. It's a tradition of resistance, right? It's a tradition of holding on to something that you do in community with others. Does that sound right, Dr. Kone?
Well, it sounds right to me. I mean, it's resistant and it's political, like what we eat and where we, to Dr. Erica's point about food deserts, what we're able to find or not find, all have political implications. I'm also thinking about other communities that have been affected by politics and culture, and how that's had an effect on their food. So what comes to mind is I'm thinking about indigenous communities within the US, and forced removal, forced migrations to reservations. We can think through like the Trail of Tears, these forced removals from, from their original lands to new lands. And some of the political effects of that would be these new foods that have been introduced into their diets. Can you weigh in on that?
All right. So before I did the whole academic thing, for like a decade prior, I worked in cultural resource management here in the Southwest. And a lot of that was archaeological excavations. And so we would sift the remains of these sites, and you'd see three things pop up like consistently, which were corn, squash, and beans. And those are like the three sisters, is what they're kind of referred to as. They're the fundamental crops in these agricultural kind of like groups that are sustaining them. And so you've got the corn that grows high, the beans come around, they repopulate nitrogen in the ground. Squash keeps it nice and cool and moist down there, and it's spiky, so it keeps predators out. And that was like 90% of their diet. And then there was also foraging on top of that. But you have these other groups who are like really a more nomadic kind of on the Great Plains. They're following buffalo where they go. They're kind of where they need to be setting up. It's kind of a much more transitory lifestyle. And if you take either one of those groups and you relocate them in a place that has poor agricultural viability, completely different ecosphere than like what they were used to begin with, you're going to have people who are reliant on the state in order to stay alive. And that's where you get these sort of food subsidy programs that come into being, where you get the sugar, the flour, the lard, and you create something delicious called fry bread. But fry bread is not something that historically has been a part of these cultures. And so you have a ton of detrimental health impacts that also arise because of that. And you see the same sort of like high cholesterol, high blood pressure, diabetes being replicated in these areas of food desert, where you have these subsidized foods, which are very cheap and plentiful, that are the only thing available. And those people's actual, like, what they're eating is impacting kind of the health impacts that they have too. So it's a huge equity problem, kind of looking at where those things arise and how are you going to deal with it? How are you going to change that? So
That's right. Equity, public health, politics, right? All of these and culture, all of these that mix right there on our plates. So.
Education. Watch
That's
more
right.
zombie history.
That's right. Well, I'm really grateful to you, Dr. Erica. I've learned so much. Liz, how about you? Learned some new things today?
I did. I've learned so much today. And I think I actually want to bring in this question that we got from Lizzie right now. So like, I think that this is a really cool place to kind of start wrapping the episode. Like, how could people who can't afford to be as conscious of where their food comes from still contribute? Right. So you can't afford it for multiple reasons. Like that could be time, that could be money, right? That could be, like you don't have the internet that you need to Google things, right? Stuff like that. How can they contribute to a better food culture? And I think maybe Erica, Dr. O'Neill, do you have any thoughts?
So I feel heartened by a lot of the projects that are happening in Arizona right now, where you have these mobile produce kind of ways to get it into places like that. Because if you cut down on that kind of burden of time and energy and like how you're going to get that, it's a fantastic first step. It's a hard question to answer, though. I mean, education is kind of, I don't want to rely on that, because even if you look at the school lunches, but that's how a lot of people who are in these sort of situations are getting their allotment of calories daily. And when COVID came and disrupted all of that, you had these huge like outbreaks of hunger in communities that weren't experiencing it before, because kids weren't getting breakfast and lunch reliably every day. So it's hard. I mean, take the first step that you can. So do something that's within your reach and your ability. If that's trading something for something that's more plant-based instead of taking a different option, like that's one. But find something that works for you. There's not a catch-all. There's not like a be-all, aside from Mark Bitterman's, I can't remember his last name, but it's like eat more plants in smaller quantities, and that's like the key to health.
I love is that I was just thinking about what you reminded me of, Erica. One thing that's a good first step is like when you're grocery shopping, if there's a little note that says where your food is coming from, right? Just being conscious of where your food is coming from. Is it coming from somewhere near you? Is it coming from a local community, or is it being imported from overseas, right? Where is your food being sourced from? And that's something even to ask, if you go to a restaurant, right? That's something to even ask the chef, like stuff like that. But if you're going to Taco Bell, I think we have a few people in the comments that are still very excited about Taco Bell in the apocalypse. Maybe go to Taco Bell. Like,
offers vegetarian and vegan options now.
I was just about to say, the potatoes are back, right? They took them away from us for a while, and now they're back. Get the potatoes. But Dr. Kone, what do you think?
As I'm hearing you all talk about these options and the journey towards, let's say, health, or considering food systems, I can't help but to think of this saying that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. And the same is true of how we eat, right? So you may not be able to go and buy organic everything. A lot of us can't, right? But we can start by incorporating one thing here and there to augment our diet. So one step at a time, everybody. We can get there and get ready for food in the apocalypse. Is that right?
Fantastic.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Erica. It was so fantastic to have you on the show and chat with you today. I hope that you're back for a second crossover episode, like next season.
Yes.
Happy to do so. Love talking food and culture.
Thank you.
It's so related to power and everything else that goes on kind of behind the scenes. So
that's right.
Happy to chat with y'all.
That's right. What they say, you are what you eat, right? That's
what you
right.
subsidize.
Including the politics of it.
Oof. Thank
Well,
you.
everyone, real lot of learning that took place on today's episode. I'm real excited to have had our guest with us today. And really, I'm excited even thinking about this topic and looking to the episode coming on next week, right? Next week, you got to check out the Go Bag Challenge with Emily Zarka. And the title of the show next week is Emergency Survival Farming. Emergency Survival Farming. Sustainable food and self-sufficiency. So it really links well into this topic that we've discussed here. So please go ahead and, of course, hit the like button and also subscribe so that you are ready for the show for next week. Actually, we've got a question for the host for next week.
Yes. I was about to jump in and say, so
Go
Dr.
for
Kone,
it.
what is our question? Emily,
Well,
we're challenging you, Emily. So my question is the future of all food Taco Bell? I really need to know.
Right. Is there hope for farming in the apocalypse?
Mhm.
That's what I want to know. Right.
We
I'll
can't
be
wait.
tuning in next week to find out. But everybody, hit the subscribe button, ring the bell, get notified to join us, as we walk through the apocalypse step by step, come through and get those additional information, tasks, and ways of thinking and knowing so that we can better survive the apocalypse. All right. So thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. And until then, hey, don't be a zombie, everybody. Know your history. All right. Take care.
I know it's crazy, but it seems so logical. I can't deny that there is something supernatural with you. Makes me act the way